Hay fever, seasonal allergies. So hay fever, as we discussed last time, is the body's reaction to a foreign agent, and that's a pollen. And your immune system sees this pollen as very strange and is determined to annihilate it, and in the process causes so much distress to you, the host, by causing runny, itchy eyes, itchy nose, and runny, itchy, scratchy throat, lots of sneezing, headache, and general discomfort in the upper part of your body. And so the typical allergens that are the culprit here are pollen from trees, grass, and weed. Now, if you have symptoms all year long, it's not because necessarily of the tree, grass, and weed, because those are seasonal. Those produce their pollen only at a certain time of the year. But if you're having runny nose and itchy eyes all year long, your allergen could be to insects, like dust mites or cockroaches. It could be to animals, like that cute little pet you have at home, your wonderful cat or your adorable dog. You could be allergic to their hair, the pet hair, and mold. Many times there's mold in our homes because of the damp condition of certain regions, and mold can cause those symptoms all year long. Now let's talk about the trees that can produce these types of pollen. The ones that we find most commonly here in Connecticut are maple, birch. I have a beautiful white birch in my backyard. We love that tree, but it's producing pollen right now, and I can see it when I go outside. And also cedar. Some of these others we don't have as commonly in Connecticut. Cottonwood, box elder, aspen, but those are other trees that commonly have pollen that can lead to allergy. So I wanted to really help us understand what we're dealing with here and try to give some pictures, because you may recognize some of these things as that we're talking about. So the white birch usually has a bark like this. It's white and it appears to be peeling sometimes, and this is the bark of a white birch right here. But it's not the bark that causes any problem. It's actually this thing here that's flowering right now. That's what comes out first on the tree. These long flowers, they release little pollens that fly throughout the ear. And here's another picture of it. Here's your birch tree. And if you
So
look,
now, Doc, I'm not sure if you're sharing your screen because I hear you talking as if we're seeing it, but I'm not seeing anything but you. So I don't know if you're trying to share your screen. I'm sorry if you're showing us something.
let's
Yeah,
see.
yeah.
Yes, I
I
certainly,
used.
it says I'm
Oh, good.
sharing.
Well, good. Well, I hear you're obvious online, just not on my screen. So don't worry about it. Go ahead.
Okay, all right. Um, so, you can't see anything. Oh,
But don't worry about it. Yeah, it's online, so we're good.
all right, beautiful. All right, so here we see a closer picture of the flower of the white birch. You will see this hanging off the white birch, and this is what the culprit is. A picture of cedar. Many of us may not recognize, but I have these in my backyard too. And the pattern here of this pine is the cedar, and that is blooming now too. And maple trees, those are very common in Connecticut. And the maple tree produces this flower here, and that releases pollen. We call these little guys helicopters, because if you pick it up off the floor, you can spin it and it will fly up and then come down like a helicopter. So those are the flowers from maple. All right, so those are trees, and more than likely, if you are having symptoms right now of hay fever, it's more than likely from trees that are producing their flowers. Now let's talk about ragweed and grass pollen. So these are the biggest offenders for seasonal allergies. About 75% of all hay fever is caused by ragweed. And ragweed is found all over the United States, but it's most common in the Midwest and the East. we have the highest concentration of ragweed. And those guys usually start to come up around the summer and early fall. So they may not be the cause of allergy symptoms right now because they're not in full bloom and they're not releasing all their pollen right as we, this time of the year. Now, what is ragweed? Many of us don't know what that looks like. Well, can you recognize this right here? Are you able to see it now? Okay.
Yes, I am. Absolutely.
Okay, beautiful. So have you ever seen this before? Does this look familiar to you, like a common weed or bush?
Yes, I have.
Yes, yes. These guys are beginning, they're going to start coming up in abundance in June, July, and they will release their pollen that will fly for miles. I mean, one little plant releases millions of pollens that just takes over and flies everywhere. And it's the pollens from these weeds here that really irritate so many people. Another picture of what it looks like. And what about this? This is one of my favorite weeds because they're so beautiful, but they can cause a lot of trouble. Golden rods. I love them. You can use their leaves and part of their stems and flowers to make teas that are really helpful for the GI tract, but their pollen can be really irritating in the nasal passage for individuals that cannot recognize these pollens as not an issue. So these also cause a lot of issues with allergies. So what can you do? You're having these symptoms and you want to know how to manage them because it's so irritating. Well, first of all, you can track the pollen count. You want to try to avoid being outside when the pollen is really high, and maybe go out when it's a little lower. And if you go to pollen, there are many sites that track pollen. Actually, you can see it in your newspapers, you can find it, you can hear it on the weather. Sometimes they report a pollen count. You can go to websites like pollen.com, and they will tell you the level of pollen and the type of pollen in your area. I went to pollen.com this morning and typed in my area, and it said that maple and juniper were big causes of pollen right now. And yesterday, the pollen count was really high. Today, it won't be so bad. And tomorrow it will be better. So you can kind of gauge and plan for your activities if you need to be outside for any long period of time.
Hmm.
Like we said before, we said Monday, avoid peak hours when the pollen is really high in the day. So early morning, like 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. is when it tends to be highest. Windy days, it's blowing and blowing and there's pollen all over. And it's best to go outside after a rainfall because the pollen count is much less. Close your windows in the car and the house if you really have bad symptoms. And you can also have an air filtered room, have one room in the house dedicated as a special air filtered room so that the allergy sufferer can go in there and not and get some relief. So you can have an air filter in that room with the windows closed. The person would of course remove pollen from their body first by taking a shower, changing their clothes, go in that air filtered room, and they can get some relief from the horrible allergy symptoms. And we discussed this last time, trying to observe foods that may trigger your pollen allergy, because these foods have similar proteins to ragweed. For example, cantaloupe is a popular one. Watermelon we discussed last time, mangoes and bananas. And as I was thinking about this some more, Pastor, I said, you know what? Just like with honey, if honey certainly has um, some pollen in there. And if you expose yourself to local honey all year long, or at least 2 months prior to the allergy season, you can have much less symptoms of hay fever. So I wonder if you expose yourself to these foods on a regular basis. You're like having a slow, constant inoculation. I'm really wondering if that will help you to deal better with the exposure when the time comes. when the pollen rises. I've never tested this, but it's just an hypothesis that to me makes sense when we think about slow inoculation to prevent an exaggerated response, like a vaccination, but every single day a tiny vaccination.
Yeah, well, that's Dr. Swaby's contention that any local foods from that
Yes,
place where you are, generally, if you stick with that, you will reduce your chances of having these allergies.
yes, yes, yes. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
But
Oh,
Dick, let me ask you this though,
yes.
because I noticed that for some reason, people in Connecticut seem to have real bad asthma
Mhm.
and this, these kind of issues. Although it seems like this is not overly manifesting itself in the COVID-19 because we don't seem to have a higher ratio than anybody else. But I know generally, I usually the reports is that folks who live in Connecticut have breathing issues and allergy issues. Why Connecticut seem to be on the East Coast here so much worse than the other places?
I don't know if Connecticut is worse per se than Rhode Island or worse than New Hampshire or worse than New York, but certainly the eastern states have east and Midwest have high incidences of certain pollen. We are in a beautiful location where we have an abundance of trees and fertilization, things growing. So if you were in the desert, like in Arizona or certain places, they don't have a high level of mold or some of these symptoms, because it's so dry there. They don't have a lot of things growing. But here we're blessed with beauty of flourishing vegetation, and so some of the drawbacks would be if you can't respond to the pollen appropriately. But there are other things like we mentioned before that can cause allergy symptoms, like dust mites and um, pets. There's a high ratio of pets in this area. Folks love their animals inside their house. Sometimes they're here and your immune system don't gel well. They're dander and you don't gel well, so you may have more triggers. But I don't know if Connecticut has a higher ratio, and I'd certainly love to look into that to see if that's the case and why that is.
Yeah, I did read that it did.
Uh-huh. Okay, well,
Mhm.
that's something that did they mention why? They probably didn't.
No, they didn't mention because they weren't addressing the issue of any type of solution. They were simply saying if you have children, then these are some things you need to be aware of. Yeah,
Because Connecticut has a worse ratio than the surrounding eastern states?
that's what they said. Yes. Mhm.
Wow, okay. Well, something to investigate and to learn more about, definitely. I will certainly
So,
look into that.
but should we be concerned about children, for example, and the things you're talking about here? I know children are not particularly susceptible to this COVID-19 virus, at least not taking their lives anyhow. Put it that way. But how does the hay fever present itself in children? Is it any different from the
Sure,
adults?
sure, sure. So children don't necessarily know how to um, they don't always understand what's happening to them when they're having these weird symptoms, and they don't know how to express it. So they won't say to you necessarily, "Oh, um, I'm having, allergies," or they may not know to express, "Oh, my throat feels itchy," and they don't always blow. Children tend to like, you know, um, draw back or sniff up their colds. They don't always blow it out. So you may not see them blow. You may see them doing a lot of sniffing and a lot of clicking noises with their throat. They don't always, they are trying to scratch their throat because it's itching them so much, but they're making these clicking noises and these scratching noises. Those may be some things for you to cue in that, oh, maybe my child is having an allergy to the local pollen that's around. And so you'd want to look into that some more and take some of these things that we're talking about to try to see how you can address their response to the pollen, trying to have them in an environment where they're not exposed to as much pollen, or removing the pollen once again inside with showers and removing their clothes, or having them get exposed to tiny inoculations of the pollen with local honey for months prior to the season, and improving their diet, so it's one that will help their immune system function more appropriately and not in such a abnormal fashion. So certainly they present a little differently with their symptoms sometimes.